us today. I really would like to express my sincere thanks for your kind invitation. And this has been such a wonderful series of talks. So I'm really honored to be a part of it. But let me start with my topic. If it moves. Okay.
It's moving.
Perfect. So let me start with some history. This is Julius, or Gilles Aupert, born 1825 in Hamburg. Gilles Aupert was a well-known French-German Assyriologist. He was naturalized French in 1854, who was in 1869 appointed professor of Assyrian philology and archaeology at the Collège de France. He was an outstanding and very much respected scholar in his time, and therefore it was Aupert who was asked by the French authorities to verify authenticity and possible significance of the clay tablets with cuneiform inscriptions that began to appear on the Egyptian antiquities market in the late 1880s. Apparently, Aupert was not impressed by these discoveries and probably considered them worthless forgeries. His skepticism probably contributed to the fact that there are not even a dozen of these texts in the collections of the Louvre today. The cuneiform clay tablets simply had no business in the Nile Valley. In a way, his opinion illustrates well a kind of inconsistency or even a discomfort of some early scholars meeting a cuneiform material in the Egyptian world. Today, or at least I hope, the opinion is considerably different, with the cuneiform tradition being understood as one of the administrative traditions of the Egyptian states and administration during the 2nd millennium BC. It was at the latest during the late Bronze Age, in the second half of the 2nd millennium, when the Egyptian administration employed, at least in its written form, a cuneiform tablet written in Akkadian in order to communicate with the local powers of the Levant, as well as the great powers of the ancient Near East. In the Levantine region, however, Akkadian had been known and used as an interlanguage already during the Middle Bronze Age, and the southern Levantine side of Hathor represented its regional center with a strong cuneiform tradition developed already in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC. At this site, a large group of cuneiform tablets produced locally containing juridical, administrative, and scholarly texts was discovered. Epistolary documents addressed to the ruler of Hathor were also discovered, illustrating the importance of the Old Babylonian cuneiform tradition in the southern areas of the Levant. At the same time, in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, the region that from the earliest times played a key role in relations between Egypt and the Near East, a series of foreign political and cultural centers gradually developed with Avaris, modern-day Tel el-Dabba, on the Pelusiac branch as its capital. Since its foundation in the 12th dynasty, the number of Syro-Palestinian inhabitants was rather high, but remained under the authority of the Egyptian king roughly until the mid-13th dynasty. At that time, the material and quite probably also the religious culture of the site clearly corresponded to what was then the Levant of the Middle Bronze Age 2AB. After the mid-17th century, the Hyksos kings controlled large areas in the Nile Delta, as well as parts of the northern Nile Valley. After this period, intensified trade and cultural contacts of Hyksos, Egypt, with other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean is well documented in the material culture. Despite some uncertainties as far as the dating of the document is concerned, a fragment of a cuneiform letter by its editors identified as late Old Babylonian text was discovered at the site of Tel el-Dabba in 2009. It was not the only cuneiform discovery there. We also have a fragment of a cuneiform ceiling dated to the same period. These two objects might actually represent underlying evidence of these contacts between the Hyksos Egypt and the Near East. Thus, it's this material that already integrates the Hyksos rulers into the communication pattern recognizable throughout the ancient Near East by the Middle Bronze Age. The tablet, labeled as TED 9420, was discovered in the palace district of the 15th dynasty, that means the Hyksos dynasty. As far as the excavation context is concerned, it was unearthed in a filling in level D2, which is at present dated by its excavators roughly to 1560 to 1530 BC, which corresponds to the very last Hyksos stratum, immediately preceding the destruction of this part of the site by the forces of Ahmose I of the 18th dynasty. The fragment of TED 9420 letter is very small. As you can see, it's roughly 2 by 1 by 1 centimeter and contains traces of 5 lines of an inscription with the lower and left edge inscribed as well. Franz von Koppen and Karin Radner, who published those texts, suggested that the tablet features a late Old Babylonian ductus. The same has been proposed for TED 9421, the seal impression, supposedly originally attached to a larger bag. In contrast to later cuneiform documents discovered in Egypt, it's highly likely that none of these 2 Old Babylonian inscriptions discovered at Tel el-Daba were actually produced in Egypt. What we can suppose is the fact that the Hyksos administration was, at the latest by mid-16th century BC, familiar with cuneiform writing and maybe even capable of understanding its message. Unfortunately, the earliest cuneiform corpus found in Egypt is still so narrow to allow for more elaborate conclusions as far as the transmission of the cuneiform culture between the Middle and the Late Bronze Age traditions in Egypt is concerned. The recent discovery of the cuneiform fragments at Tel el-Daba might represent the earliest trace of this tradition. This tradition was, even if only intermittently, maintained well into the 13th century BC, as attested by the Egyptian Hittite correspondence from Hattusha, and by a fragmentary letter discovered in the Ramesside Center of Pyramessa in 2003. I have already mentioned a rather ambivalent attitude of Egyptology, or maybe better to say Egyptologists, towards cuneiform writing. Nevertheless, when finally accepted, even scholars usually associate the cuneiform tradition in Egypt with the discovery of the so-called Amarna archive late in the 1880s. And it's no surprise, having looked into the earliest publications dealing with cuneiform and registered in the online Egyptological bibliography, the earliest entries under the keyword Keilschrift or cuneiform are those that you can see on the screen. Let me quote. In 1888, there was made in Egypt a most surprising discovery of letters and dispatches written almost wholly in the Babylonian script and language. A peasant woman living in the wretched little mud village of Tel el-Amarna on the eastern bank of the Nile, about 160 miles south of Cairo, was searching for antiquities among the sand and rubbish of a great tell some distance back from the river. Her object was only to find stone or brick for repairs to her squalid house, or antiquia, which might be sold to the strange people from Europe or America, who buy things simply because they are old. In the mound, she found the dried and worm-eaten remains of ancient wooden record boxes, and from these she extracted more than 300 inscribed clay tablets and fragments of tablets. End of quote. This is a story that we usually read when we meet the story of the Amarna letters. But, well, we will shortly see that the story is very far from truth. The corpus of Amarna tablets, which is or had been in the past available for study, counts altogether 382 texts and fragments. But unfortunately, it's only in case of 31 of these that we can more or less reliably reconstruct their original find spot. These 31 inscribed and 3 uninscribed tablets or fragments were excavated at the site of Tel el-Amarna during a series of archaeological works conducted by several archaeological missions, starting with the excavations directed by William Matthew Flinders Petrie in 1891. Petrie arrived to the site in November 1891, and in spite of the gloomy archaeological situation, he inaugurated his excavations already shortly after his arrival. With respect to the site, Petrie himself refers to, among other things, previous activities carried out by both the museum authorities and an infamous antiquities dealer. It's only at the end of January 1892 that Petrie mentions in his unpublished journal, at present kept in the archives of the Griffith Institute in Oxford, I quote, "At last, I've got touch of the cuneiform tablets," end of quote. What follows is the famous description of old rubbish pits under the house walls in which the tablets were supposed to have been found. Over the course of his work, Petrie was able to uncover altogether 21 texts of both epistolary and scholarly nature, plus one uninscribed tablet, all of them presently housed in the collection of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So as far as the Amarna corpus is concerned, it's rather unfortunate that neither in his publication relating to the excavations at Amarna, nor in his journal, Petrie specifies which tablets have been discovered in the individual rubbish pits, and which is the tablet discovered in the so-called block number 21. As far as the undisputable find spot of the remaining Amarna tablets are concerned, both excavations of the German Orientalist Society under the directorship of Ludwig Borchardt and the excavations of Egypt Exploration Society, headed first by Thomas Eric Peat and subsequently by John Pendlebury, bring us more authoritative data. During Borchardt's work in the area of the main city, 2 more inscribed tablets were uncovered, while the EES excavations enriched the collection by means of 9 more inscribed and 2 more uninscribed tablets or their respective fragments. Both of these school texts were discovered in a more remote area of the main city, and in both cases the tablets were found in a non-official context, EA 359 in 047-2 and EA 379 in N47-3. In the area of the main city, or more particularly in 049-23, another school text, EA 368, was discovered in the course of the very first excavation season carried out by the Egypt Exploration Society, headed by the British Egyptologist Thomas Eric Peat. Later on, during 1933-34 excavation season, 8 more inscribed plus 2 more uninscribed tablets were discovered by the EES mission, then led by John Pendlebury. With the exception of a single tablet, all the others were once again discovered in the administrative quarter, located to the east of the royal palace in the central city, and previously excavated by Flinders Petrie. That means in the area of the Royal Archive and Scriptorium. Unfortunately, leaving aside the published data of the discovery of the EES tablets, no other details could be elicited from the documents kept in the archive of the EES. In light of this, it's very unfortunate that with respect to the total number of all Amarna tablets, the tablets with known find spot represent less than 10% of the material at our disposal. Material that would be really, really useful in order to recognize the structure of the administrative structure of the central city. The earliest modern history of the collection of the Amarna tablets is closely related to private excavations carried on at the site by the antiquities dealer Farek Ismail from Giza. Contrary to reports referred to by Knudson that the tablets discovered either during the autumn or by the end of 1887, there are certain indications that the tablets might have actually been found already during the late spring or over the summer of that year. The main evidence can be found in the documents which are housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, or more precisely in the Journal d'Entrée, in which several registration entries for objects coming from the region of Middle Egypt, Akhmim, or even the site of Amarna itself, and clearly identifiable within the reign of Amenhotep IV Akhetaten, can be recognized. Contrary to various scenarios transmitted both in scholarly and more popular literature, the discovery of the Amarna tablets can hence no longer be interpreted as purely accidental, since we can reliably trace its history back to the aforementioned private excavations. So as far as the identity of the scribes of the Amarna letters is concerned, the subject can be, at the very most, described as questionable or even dubious. By dint of a great effort of various scholars, we are more or less familiar with the curriculum the scribes followed, and by means of educational documents, we are not totally ignorant of the system of their education. To set the scribes living at Tel el-Amarna within the broader context of the Egyptian scribal traditions, we need to revise the archaeological context of the discovery of the tablets and to discuss the potential relations between the Egyptian and the, let's say, cuneiform world in relation to the pharaoh's office. As it has been already mentioned, at present we can identify the find spot of Amarna tablets more reliably only in case of approximately 31 EA numbers. With a certain reservation, we may, however, presuppose that, as far as the place of the initial discovery of the Amarna archive in 1887 is concerned, the absolute majority of the tablets issues from an archaeological unstratified and highly unreliable context. However, in all likelihood, it seems that also these tablets from the initial discovery were indeed unearthed in the area of the central city, in the vicinity of the complex identified later as Q4221. According to the overview, we can clearly see that despite the fact that in isolated cases, some of the tablets were actually discovered in the areas of habitation, or in other words, in a domestic context, the absolute majority of the material originates from the setting affiliated with the official activities. The Foreign Office is a set of buildings, including the Records Office. It's located in the central city. The block consists of 4 structures aligned along a common axis, running roughly from north to south. 3 of these buildings from north to south, Q42-1, 42-7, and 42-5, were originally built against each other. The southernmost building, 4221, is detached from the other structures by a corridor running roughly east-west. Despite the rather bad state of preservation of the complex at the time of its excavation, which is especially true for Q42-1, the northernmost one, it's evident that the main access to these buildings was provided from the west. That means from the area located behind the King's House enclosure. According to the published plan of the site, only Q42-1 and 4221, we can identify entrances also from the east side. This is especially important for 4221 because this entrance provided an immediate access to the large room in which the tablets are said to have been found. Regrettably, the state of preservation did not allow us to reconstruct the presence of a door connecting the above-mentioned eastern part of the building with the western part, accessible, like the other structures in the Foreign Office, from the west. The existence of the eastern entrance to the Records Office, however, is very important because it allows a direct access to other structures, which are located on the east side of the street, especially to the House of Life, located southeast of the Records Office. While the Records Office can be interpreted in a, let's say, very simplified way as a kind of a representative of a cuneiform culture, the House of Life can be seen in the same perspective as a representative of the Egyptian scribal tradition. So looking at the site as being a place of production of clay tablets, we simply cannot put aside the most primary questions. That means where and how the tablets were produced. In order to produce the tablets, the following a place to store or to deposit the clay. The scribes had to have an access to a water supply, or the water had to be accessible or available to them during the process of manufacture. And finally, there had to be kilns in order to bake the tablets. And I will come to last point later. In search for these answers, we may, to some degree, take up the results of petrological analysis of the Amarna tablets. It flows from the analysis that for the tablets of Egyptian origin, that means tablets that were produced locally at Tel el Amarna, two different clay types were employed. The first of them is a clay type of Nile silt of local origin that was predominantly used for normal pottery production, so the very simple cooking pots, as well as for some of the analyzed Amarna documents, like 163, 339, 368, and 382. So in all these cases, these are documents that can be understood as informal documents, including probably drafts or copies, a scholarly text, or a document which was not even produced by a local royal scriptorium. On the other hand, the group of formal documents, that means letters issued by the Royal Scribal Office, as well as corollary documents used at the same place, was written on marl clay of Esna formation, which is not documented in the area of Amarna, and therefore it had to be transported there. This scheme in the employment of particular types of clay perfectly fit into the Egyptian bureaucratic mind. The division of the material between inferior and superior quality is so well attested in the Egyptian scribal and archival practices. The fact that the scribes were able to use both types of clay also suggests that, first, they had to have an access to both materials, which was obviously no problem for them belonging to an official institution or a royal workshop. And second, there had to be two distinct storage places, or a common storage place where the stony lumps of clay could be kept separately, for example, in baskets or something similar. This is especially true for the marl clay because it really dries rather quickly after being exposed to the air. Unfortunately, the course of earlier excavations in the area of Records Office does not allow us to identify any storage place of this kind with any level of certainty. The petrographic analysis of the material clearly revealed that all formal documents of Egyptian provenance were actually baked. But are we able to identify any kilns in the corresponding complex? Only here we can actually give a positive answer, though we might actually add possibly. We can only fall back on the EES report concerning the excavations of the Records Office. After a description of the unfortunate state of preservation of the complex, including a reference to a possible place of discovery of the tablets, I quote, "The cuneiform tablets were said to have been found in the pit below the level of the floor in the main room to the east." End of quote. The excavators concentrate upon a description of the structure. The main entrance is supposed from the east, leading immediately to the room in which the tablets were found, with a flight of stairs in its northeast corner. In a room immediately to the north, two ovens were located. Pendlebury suggested a link between the existence of these two ovens with the practice of serving hot drinks, in modern day tea, in Pendlebury's days it was still coffee, in governmental offices in the Near East. Unfortunately, no description of the ovens is given. Nevertheless, Pendlebury's explanation as far as the presence of the ovens is concerned does not seem to be very possible. The fact that the original excavators were not always aware of the true function of the facilities discovered can be well illustrated by another example, an example of a bread oven discovered by the expedition of Ludwig Borchardt in the main city. Following the re-excavation of the structure, Paul Nicholson clearly demonstrated that the kiln had been used for making pottery rather than bread. So, could the two ovens have been used to bake the tablets produced in the records office? In the event of a positive answer to this particular question, we may consequently assume that at least in this respect, the office was self-contained as far as the production of the tablets is concerned. By its nature, a cuneiform tablet made of clay is a ceramic artifact. Unfortunately, unlike pottery production, the process of production of clay tablets is not known in detail. The relevant information is scattered in time and space, and parallels drawn from the knowledge of pottery production may not only be insufficient, but maybe even misleading. When published in 2004, the volume Inscribing Clay, Provenance Study of the Amarna Letters and Other Ancient Near Eastern Texts represented a new and important contribution to the field of Amarna studies. By bringing a series of mineralogical and chemical analysis into the discussion, the traditional accepted provenance of a large number of texts was either confirmed, elaborated, or actually put into question. One of the rather controversial issues addressed in the volume is the process of tablets baking. The baking of tablets is a practice attested both in archaeological context and textual sources. In many cases, however, there are uncertainties or doubts as to whether specific tablets were baked originally in antiquity or whether it was a modern process that may have occurred shortly after the discovery, as we can see, for example, for tablets from Tel Asmar, or after the tablets reached a museum collection. In this respect, the museum records are usually not very telling. The method of archaeomagnetic dating, which could help in determining the moment in time when a particular tablet was baked, or in other words, whether the baking was done in antiquity or in modern days, either when it was discovered or when it was brought to a museum collection, is generally not available in museum collections. Thus, as to whether the Amarna tablets had been fired or not, as well as to estimate the eventual firing temperatures, was one of the research questions targeted in the study of Goren, Finkelstein, and Naaman. The baking temperatures were estimated depending on changes visible in the physical structure of different minerals as well as vegetable materials. A conservation practice of baking the tablets, aiming at their better preservation, was also taken into an account. At present, the set of Amarna documents of Egyptian origin, the official documents, the letters and inventories, consists of 11 EE numbers, 10 letters, and 1 inventory. 9 of these letters are written in Akkadian and 1 in Hittite. In 2 cases, the documents are fragmentary, with the fragments housed in different museum collections. So while one fragment of letter EA5 is located in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the other part is in the British Museum. The largest part of the inventory, EA14, is in Berlin in the Vorderasiatisches Museum, whereas the Ashmolean Museum houses one small fragment of the text. These texts of Egyptian origin are divided among 6 different museums. 3 EA members are in London, 3 in Cairo, 3 in Berlin, 2 in Oxford, and 1 in Brussels and Paris, respectively. As likewise, in the case of the other sets, we shall see later, the corpus of texts of Egyptian origin consists mainly of documents discovered during the earliest phase of private excavations at Amarna. This applies both to texts that entered the collections already at the turn of the 1880s and 1890s, and those arriving to museums much later. 3 of these EA numbers, however, originate in archaeologically controlled excavations, either by Flinders Petrie in 1891 or during the Egypt Exploration Society mission in 1933-34 excavation season. Excavating the tablets, both Petrie and Pendlebury work in the same area of the central city, most likely in the same places as their predecessors during the initial find. In this way, some fragments of EA14 could be purchased by the Berlin Museum, while another fragment of the very same text was actually excavated by Petrie at the site in 1891. As for the chronology of these documents, they cover unevenly the reigns of 2 Egyptian kings, Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV Akhetaten. Petrographically, the Amarna epistolary corpus of Egyptian origin is a very homogeneous one, with tablets mostly made of marl clay of Esna formation, as I've already mentioned. The only exception is represented by EA 163, which is, similar to other non-official school texts, made of a local Nile silt. So similar to Goren, Finkelstein, and Naaman, I'm inclined to believe that this tablet should be considered part of the scribal curriculum. Homogeneity of the material also occurs in the technology of the tablet production. All analyzed samples revealed a similar scenario. Both the letters and the inventory were very lightly baked with temperatures not exceeding 500 Celsius. Neither in the case of the situation shortly after the discovery, nor the museum records indicate that this baking took place recently and hence can be considered an integral part of the technological process. So to conclude, all the examined tablets show the same method of production, which is the expected conclusion in the case of a single production center and tradition. The area of the administrative quarter in the central city is well known from the very beginning of its excavations for the presence of hieratic inscriptions, identifying the individual constructions and associating it with the presence of scribal offices. However, neither the inscriptions preserved on the desert stones nor the prosopography of the Amarna scribes reveals any difference between the employees of the 2 scriptoria, and only the existence of 2 scribal traditions might actually indicate a double structure of the scribes. With respect to the scribes of Amarna, the Amarna letters provide us with the title used for these scribes, Shachshicha, preserved in a postscript of 3 EA 316 and traditional link to the Egyptian title of a letter writer or epistolary secretary, Sesh Shat. The employment of this title during the 18th dynasty is very limited, and until present, we don't have any attestation of this title, neither from the city of Amarna itself, nor from the Amarna period. Another identification of a scribe responsible for the manipulation of the royal correspondence can be recognized in the postscripts of 4 letters from Jerusalem to Psharshari, king's or royal scribe, which might either simply refer to the function of the scribe at the royal court or be a translation of an existing Egyptian title with possible parallels Sesh Nesud, royal scribe, or Sesh Nesud Ma'at, true royal scribe or royal secretary. So if we want to conclude this part concerning the scribes, the records office was undoubtedly both a center of storage and production. The office itself was an integral part of an administrative quarter in the central city, and its position was intentional because its connection to the house of life is quite visible. We don't have a separate storage place for clay nor a source of water identified. They were dependent on external sources. But as for the baking of the tablets, which is a practice unparalleled in the Egyptian scribal office, in this regards, records office was a self-contained and self-sufficient functional unit. And there are no peculiarities related to the scribes, and nothing suggests an existence of a group of foreign scribes employed in the records office. The education of Egyptian scribes in cuneiform culture and its writing system undoubtedly personifies an element of interaction between Egyptian and Near Eastern traditions. Interesting phenomena for study are the mechanisms of acquisition and adaptation of cuneiform culture in the Egyptian society. Without doubt, this process occurred over a lengthy period of time, intermittently and with at least 3 waves according to the preserved evidence: the late Second Intermediate Period tradition, the Amarna, and the Ramesside corpora, with Akkadian primarily serving as interlanguage or communicationsmedium between individual correspondents. Ever since Caspar Riemschneider's lecture, Who Taught Babylonian to the Egyptians in 1976, the theory of a possible Hittite background for the Egyptian experience in cuneiform writing has been widely accepted and elaborated by other scholars, especially by Gary Beckman in 1983 and Gernot Wilhelm in 1984. In recent years, several essential studies of the Amarna material had been published, significantly advancing our understanding of the corpus, and including a discussion on the production and origin of the tablets, as well as more general conclusions as far as the functioning of the system is concerned. Among these, the prominent study of Yuval Goren, Nadav Naaman, and Israel Finkelstein in 2004 takes a fundamental position. The language of the Egyptian Akkadian corpus has been studied by Matthias Müller in 2010 and Tzipora Kochavi-Reini in 2011. In light of this, it's the aim to evaluate the original proposal of Riemschneider and the others, taking into consideration the results of the latest studies based on palaeographic analysis of both the epistolary and the school texts, admittedly originating in Egypt, and comparing these results with the palaeographical study of the Hittite corpus, as well as those of the school texts brought to Amarna from outside. Studying the Amarna corpus in order to obtain a more complex picture on acquisition of the cuneiform writing in Egypt, the following sets of documents must be taken into consideration: letters produced in Egypt and being related to the Egyptian royal scriptorium. This corpus counts altogether 12 documents, out of which 7 have been petrologically analyzed, and their Egyptian provenance is therefore confirmed. For the remaining documents hold that their Egyptian origin has been largely postulated upon the identification of respective senders and contents of the individual texts. In the context of further discussion, a special attention must be given to EA 31, a letter written in Hittite and addressed to by the Egyptian king to the king of Arzala. School text, that means a set of documents closely related to the education of Amarna scribes. At present, the corpus consists of 26 documents applicable. I'm sorry, I'm crying. Just give me a second. Sorry, it's becoming too dark. So at present, the corpus of school text consists of 26 documents applicable to further analysis. Similar to the previous group, there are also tablets analyzed petrologically and tablets with insecure origin. It's important to stress that among those documents, petrologically analyzed and non-Egyptian origin has been established in 3 cases only, and I will return to this slightly later. And having in mind the suggested Hittite source of the Egyptian cuneiform tradition, we have to take into consideration also the tablets produced in Khati and dated to the Amarna period. And in this respect, the corpus is rather narrow, numbering altogether 5 texts, all of them of the epistolary genre and 3 of them analyzed petrographically. Analyzing the corpus of Akkadian letters from Egypt, we can see that the original hypothesis of Riemschneider I'm so sorry. This is the time of the year for all of us suffering with allergies. So analyzing this corpus, However, it's important to stress that none of the letters shows completely Hittite ductus, but what largely prevails is the so-called mixed ductus recognized by Elena de Vecchi among the contemporary Amarna letters of Hittite provenance. In the repertoire of Amarna Egyptian texts, we may recognize typical Hittite signs of that period, such as Ni, Ak, La, Al, or It, or known from contemporaneous Akkadian texts from Hatti. On the other hand, similar to the Amarna Hittite corpus, there are several signs largely attested in the northern Levantine areas. And the fact that among the Amarna letters of the Egyptian origin, a mixed ductus known to us from the contemporaneous Amarna letters from Hatti prevails is perfectly in accordance with our expectations. So conclusions as far as the Amarna school texts are concerned are rather complex. What we can see here is an interesting combination of an original and modified Babylonian tradition mixed up with the Hittito-Egyptian elements, known to us from the contemporaneous letters. Such a situation only punctuates the question whether some of the letters preserved in the so-called records office might have actually served as model letters. We may also presume that the Amarna archive, including the school text, represents an example of the so-called dead archive, meaning that the texts were discarded by the ancients themselves. Since the Amarna archive documents predating the foundation of the city of Akhetaten were discovered, we assume that they were transferred there from Thebes due to their active status at the time when the capital and the royal residence were moved to Amarna early in the 5th year of Amenhotep IV Akhetaten. However, the same practice can be expected at the time when the city was preparing to be abandoned and archive files had to be transferred to the new administrative center, whether the traditional political and religious center in Thebes in the south or an important administrative hub in the Memphis in the north. So to conclude, a palaeographic analysis of the Egyptian Amarna documents shows that both the letters and more than a half of the preserved school texts attest a so-called mixed ductus, known from the contemporary Amarna letters from Hatti. I believe that it's a next and eligible step to try to identify when and how did the Egyptians learn this writing system. I'm well aware of the fact that we are now entering a sphere of an extensive uncertainty or even speculations, but in respect to mechanisms of communication attested between the two empires in the 13th century, I would like to join the opinion that it could have happened during another episode of close contacts between Egypt and Hatti, and more precisely to the time when the so-called Kurushtama Treaty has been drafted. The opinion on the exact date of this act differs extensively, with the reign of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, or Amenhotep III being the most often considered options. Nevertheless, even an earlier dating to the reign of Thutmose I or to the time of Thutmose IV, and thus preceding the reign of the latest of the possible candidates on the Egyptian side, have not been ruled out completely. However, if the mixed ductus has been really introduced at the time of Kurushtama Treaty, we may bracket the earliest suggested dates. Unfortunately, up to now, there is no clear anchor to date the earliest experience with the mixed ductus in Hatti, and it might be very difficult to find particular scribes which might be attached to it directly. But I don't want to go too deep to the problems of the mixed ductus and the scribes using it. However, it's obvious that their schooling was influenced by North Syrian and eventually Babylonian schooling, and that would place the arrival of the mixed ductus together with the Babylonian scribes. However, it again leaves the dating question open, since we know that the Babylonian scribes were visiting Hattusha as early as the days of Hattushili I, at least. It seems possible that the use of the mixed ductus would be intensified when the Babylonian tradition of the script became somehow old-fashioned, and namely with the Hurrian scribes of the 14th century, and therefore searching for the resources of the Egyptian Amarna cuneiform tradition, we have to take into consideration and ponder on the idea of the common source for the Hittite and Egyptian script, namely the Hurrian scribes. Thank you for your attention.